What if the most explosive royal breakup of our time didn't begin with another headline, but with a silence that lasted too long? Think about that for a second. Not a screaming match, not a paparazzi photo, not even a carefully worded statement released at 5 a.m. Just silence. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The kind of silence that creeps in when something has already gone terribly wrong. For months, the public saw smiles, carefully curated appearances, vague quotes about growth, healing, and the next chapter. But behind those images, behind the polished words, insiders claimed something far darker was unfolding. A private reckoning, a line crossed, and a moment when Prince Harry allegedly realized that the marriage he once defended at all costs had become something else entirely, something he could no longer survive. Ask yourself this. How does a man who walked away from a throne, a family, and an entire institution suddenly find the strength to walk away from the one person he once said saved him? That's the question at the heart of this story. And the answer, according to whispers from multiple sides, has everything to do with betrayal, leverage, and a kind of pressure that doesn't leave bruises, but leaves scars all the same. Because this isn't just another celebrity divorce rumor. This is a story about power, about control, about what happens when private pain becomes currency, and about why, at a certain point, even love is no longer enough. Let's rewind. When Prince Harry first met Meghan Markle, the world was introduced to a narrative that felt almost too perfect. A modern love story. A prince haunted by grief, finding connection with a confident outsider who promised something different. Freedom, understanding, a life away from the rigid expectations of palace walls. And for a while, that story worked. Or at least, it appeared to. But what happens when a relationship is born not in calm, but in chaos? When every step forward is taken under flashing cameras, leaking sources, and unrelenting judgment? When love doesn't get the chance to breathe before it's forced to perform? From the very beginning, this marriage existed under pressure. Pressure from the press, pressure from the palace, pressure from the public. And perhaps most dangerously, pressure from the expectations placed on it to mean something bigger than two people choosing each other. Harry wasn't just falling in love. He was making a statement. And statements come with consequences. Ask yourself this. Can a marriage survive when it becomes a symbol before it becomes a partnership? Because insiders say that long before the public heard the word divorce, long before rumors of legal teams and quiet separations began circulating, the real cracks had already formed. Not loudly, subtly, in private conversations that never made headlines, in decisions framed as necessary but felt as unavoidable, in compromises that slowly stopped feeling mutual. Harry has always spoken openly about his fear of history repeating itself. His mother, the press, the institution. The sense of being trapped while the world watches, waiting for the next fracture. So when he chose Meghan, he chose her fiercely. He defended her publicly when few others would. He cut ties, burned bridges, and accepted exile rather than risk losing her. To many, that loyalty looked unbreakable. But loyalty has a limit. And according to those close to the situation, that limit wasn't reached because of another person or a single explosive argument. It was reached because of something far more unsettling. Control. Here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the betrayal being whispered about isn't the kind that fits neatly into tabloid headlines. It's not about infidelity in the traditional sense. It's about strategy, influence, and the alleged use of deeply personal vulnerabilities as leverage. Take a moment and ask yourself this. What does betrayal look like when love and ambition collide? Insiders describe a shift. A moment when private disagreements allegedly became pressure points. When deeply personal fears, family wounds, and past trauma were no longer just shared in confidence, but used in moments of conflict. Not overtly, not cruelly, at least not at first, but subtly enough that Harry didn't recognize it right away. Imagine being told that certain actions are for your own good. That silence is protection. That distancing yourself from certain people is necessary. That holding information, or releasing it strategically, is just part of survival. Where does support end and manipulation begin? That's the question Harry allegedly started asking himself far too late. And the more he asked it, the more uncomfortable the answers became. This is where the phrase royal blackmail begins to surface, not as an accusation proven in court, not as a confirmed criminal act, but as a term insiders used to describe a dynamic that felt increasingly transactional. Because blackmail doesn't always involve envelopes or threats. Sometimes it looks like emotional leverage. Sometimes it sounds like, if you don't do this, then this will happen. And sometimes it's wrapped in the language of protection and narrative control. Harry, by all accounts, understands narratives. He's lived inside them his entire life. He knows how stories are shaped, how silence can be weaponized, how carefully timed disclosures can change public perception overnight. Which is why, according to those close to him, the realization was devastating. If the person you trust most begins to speak the language of leverage, what does that say about the relationship you're in? For a long time, Harry reportedly tried to rationalize it, to frame it as stress, trauma responses, the cost of living under constant scrutiny. And maybe, for a while, that explanation was enough. But something changed. Sources describe a period of isolation. Friends who once had access no longer did. Calls that went unanswered. Relationships that quietly faded, not because of arguments, but because of absence. Ask yourself this. Who benefits when one partner stands alone? Harry has spoken before about how isolating royal life felt. The irony, insiders say, is that he may have recreated a version of that isolation in his new life, only without the safety net of an institution he once despised. And that's when the fear set in, not fear of divorce, fear of losing himself. Because when your world narrows to a single voice, a single narrative, a single version of reality, something inside you starts to resist. Quietly at first, then more urgently. That resistance, according to insiders, is what triggered the unraveling. There was reportedly a moment. No one agrees exactly when it happened. No one agrees on the words that were said. But multiple sources point to the same emotional outcome. Clarity. A realization that love had become conditional. That loyalty had become expected, not reciprocated. And that staying silent no longer felt like protection, but surrender. This is where the story matters now. Because what we're seeing today, the rumors, the alleged legal consultations, the carefully worded public distance, didn't appear out of nowhere. They are the result of a slow accumulation of moments where Harry allegedly felt cornered. And here's the twist. Walking away from the marriage wasn't framed internally as defeat. It was framed as survival. According to those close to him, the word divorce didn't come with rage. It came with exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that follows prolonged emotional tension. The kind that says, I can't do this anymore. Not in anger, but in resignation. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Because leaving isn't simple when children are involved. When legacies are involved. When every decision is dissected by millions who don't know the full story, but feel entitled to judge it anyway. Insiders say this is where leverage became most frightening. Because the stakes weren't just personal. They were generational. What happens when the future becomes a bargaining chip? What happens when custody, identity, and narrative are all intertwined? And what happens when one side allegedly believes they hold more cards than the other? This is the point where Harry's lifelong fear of repeating history reportedly collided with his present reality. A mother who felt trapped, a son who felt powerless, and a pattern he swore he would never relive. So when whispers began that he was preparing to walk away, the palace wasn't shocked. That's another detail insiders keep repeating. They weren't shocked. They were prepared. Quietly, legally, strategically. As if they had been waiting for this moment, not because they wanted it, but because they knew it was inevitable. Think about that irony. The institution Harry rejected may have been the one anticipating his return, not physically, but emotionally. As someone who finally understood the cost of warping love into narrative warfare. And that's where this story leaves us at the edge of something bigger. Because the divorce, if it comes, isn't the end. It's the beginning of a battle over truth. Over who controls the story. Over whether silence will continue to be used as leverage, or whether someone finally decides to speak. And if that happens, everything changes. Because what comes next isn't about love lost. It's about secrets exposed. And the first of those secrets, insiders say, is far more damaging than anyone realizes. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the secret everyone missed wasn't hidden in a leaked message or a dramatic confrontation, but in the way the marriage was built from the very start. Think about it. Before the vows, before the titles, before the world decided who the heroes and villains were supposed to be. Because if you really want to understand how this relationship allegedly reached the point of collapse, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the fairy tale version, the pressure cooker version. Ask yourself this. Can any relationship survive when it's forced to become a symbol before it becomes a partnership? From the outside, it looked romantic, almost cinematic. A prince scarred by loss meets a confident outsider who promises warmth, understanding, and a new way forward. The narrative wrote itself, and the world devoured it. But insiders say the real story started with urgency, with decisions that were rushed not because of love alone, but because of circumstances closing in from all sides. The press was relentless. The palace was cautious. The public was divided. And in the middle of it all were two people being asked, implicitly and explicitly, to prove something. Prove this wasn't a mistake. Prove this was worth the chaos. Prove this love could withstand everything being thrown at it. That kind of pressure changes how relationships form. Instead of slow discovery, there was acceleration. Instead of private problem solving, there was public positioning. Instead of learning each other quietly, there was defending each other loudly. And here's the contradiction no one likes to talk about. When a relationship is born in defense mode, it often stays there. Harry wasn't just choosing a partner. He was choosing a side. And once that line was drawn, stepping back became almost impossible without looking like betrayal. So he leaned in. He defended. He shielded. He cut off anyone who questioned the pace or the direction. At the time, it looked like devotion. In hindsight, insiders say it may have been something else entirely. Survival. Because when the world is attacking something you love, you don't stop to ask whether the structure itself is stable. You just hold it up, no matter the cost. And the cost, according to those close to the situation, was balance. The marriage didn't grow in calm. It grew in crisis. Every disagreement was amplified by external noise. Every compromise carried symbolic weight. Every choice felt final, irreversible, loaded with meaning far beyond two people trying to figure each other out. Ask yourself this. How do you learn who someone really is when you're constantly fighting the same enemy together? It creates a bond, yes, but it can also create blind spots. Early on, Harry reportedly interpreted intensity as commitment, passion as certainty, decisiveness as strength. And maybe, at first, those interpretations felt right. But intensity doesn't fade when the crisis fades. It redirects. And insiders say that once the immediate external battle shifted, that same intensity allegedly turned inward. This is where the marriage began to change. Not overnight. Not explosively. Gradually. Small decisions became tests of loyalty. Disagreements became measures of alignment. Support became something that had to be demonstrated, not assumed. Where once there was us against the world, there was now are you with me on this? And that question, repeated often enough, starts to feel less like reassurance and more like pressure. Harry has always been open about wanting to escape rigid systems. He wanted freedom, authenticity, emotional honesty. But according to those familiar with the dynamic, he may not have realized how quickly a new system was forming around him. One built not on hierarchy and protocol, but on emotional expectation. Because when a relationship becomes the only safe place in a hostile world, it can quietly become the only place that matters. Everything else fades. Friends drift. Family becomes complicated. Alternative perspectives feel dangerous. Not because they're wrong, but because they threaten the fragile equilibrium holding everything together. And here's where the foundation matters. Because a marriage built under pressure doesn't just carry love into the future. It carries fear. Fear of losing the narrative. Fear of giving critics validation. Fear of admitting that some choices were made too fast, too publicly, too permanently. Insiders say that fear shaped how conflicts were handled. Rather than pause, reassess, or step back, the instinct was often to double down, to control the story, to manage perception, to ensure that whatever happened privately never contradicted what had been presented publicly. Ask yourself this. When does protecting the image start overriding protecting the relationship? That tension, sources claim, sat at the core of the marriage for years. Harry wanted peace, stability, a sense of safety he had chased his entire life. But peace can't exist where everything feels like a performance. And stability can't grow when the foundation is constantly being reinforced instead of examined. There's another uncomfortable truth insiders point to. The faster a relationship escalates, the fewer opportunities there are to learn how the other person handles disagreement when there's nothing to prove. Because early conflict was framed as external. The press, the palace, the institution. Later conflict, however, had nowhere else to go. So it landed between them. Decisions about where to live, who to trust, what to share, what to withhold. Each one became symbolic. Each one felt like a referendum on loyalty. And loyalty, once quantified, becomes transactional. That's when cracks begin to form. Not visible ones. Hairline fractures. The kind you ignore because everything still looks intact from the outside. Harry reportedly began to feel it during moments that should have been calm. After big moves were made. After victories were declared. After the world moved on to the next headline. Instead of relief, there was tension. Instead of settling, there was vigilance. Why? Because when a relationship is built on momentum, slowing down feels like losing. And slowing down, insiders say, was never encouraged. This is where some close to Harry say he started to feel something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, unease. A quiet sense that disagreement was becoming dangerous. That certain topics triggered defensiveness rather than discussion. That expressing doubt felt like betrayal rather than honesty. Ask yourself this: when did honesty become risky? That question didn't explode all at once. It lingered, and it lingered until it intersected with something even more powerful: control over the future. Because once children entered the picture, everything shifted. The marriage wasn't just about two adults navigating fame anymore. It was about legacy, about identity, about where those children would grow up, what stories they would inherit, and which side of history they would be told they belonged to. And this is where insiders say the foundation began to strain under its own weight. Because fear, when mixed with high stakes, doesn't disappear. It escalates. Suddenly, decisions weren't just emotional, they were strategic. Conversations weren't just about feelings, they were about outcomes. And disagreements weren't just personal, they were existential. Who controls the environment? Who controls the narrative? Who controls access? These are not the questions healthy marriages want to answer, but they are the questions that arise when the foundation is built on pressure instead of trust. Harry, according to sources, began to recognize a pattern he had sworn he would never repeat. Not because the situation was identical to his past, but because the emotional mechanics felt familiar. Isolation disguised as protection, silence framed as safety, sacrifice presented as love, and that recognition was terrifying. Because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that walking away from one institution hadn't guaranteed freedom from another kind of control. It meant admitting that love alone doesn't dissolve power dynamics. And it meant confronting the possibility that the marriage he fought so hard to defend may have been formed under conditions that made collapse inevitable. That realization didn't make headlines. It didn't trigger immediate action, but it changed everything. Because once you see the foundation clearly, you can't unsee it. And once that happens, every interaction is filtered through a new lens. Is this about us, or about the story? Is this about healing, or about leverage? Is this love, or fear of losing control? Insiders say these questions haunted Harry long before any talk of divorce surfaced publicly. And they set the stage for what came next. Because when a foundation cracks, the first collapse isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It happens in trust. It happens in tone. It happens when you stop sharing freely and start measuring every word. And that, according to those closest to the situation, is exactly where this marriage found itself just before the first alleged betrayal surfaced. Not the betrayal everyone expects, but the one that changes how everything else is interpreted. Because once that line was crossed, the marriage wasn't just under pressure anymore. It was under threat. And the next chapter begins with the moment Harry allegedly realized that the person he built everything around might also be the person holding the most power over his future. What if the thing Prince Harry feared most wasn't divorce, but recognition? Recognition that the pattern he spent his entire adult life running from had quietly followed him into the very place he believed was his refuge. Ask yourself this: what happens when the past you escaped starts whispering in the present you built? Because for Harry, history is never just history. It's memory. It's trauma. It's a warning that never fully switches off. From the moment he was old enough to understand what happened. What if things don't improve? What if communication doesn't open? What if silence becomes the norm? Those questions didn't lead directly to divorce. They led to awareness. And awareness is dangerous when it collides with power dynamics. Because once you see where leverage exists, you also see where vulnerability lies. And Harry reportedly realized something chilling. The things he feared most losing, access, narrative, stability, identity, were also the things that could be used to keep him compliant. That realization didn't make him angry. It made him careful. And when someone becomes careful instead of open, the relationship has already shifted. This is the emotional space the marriage occupied just before the next phase began. A space filled with unspoken tension, unresolved fear, and a man confronting the possibility that the past he escaped might not be behind him after all. And that's where the story turns darker. Because fear alone doesn't end marriages. But fear combined with leverage? That's when everything changes. And the next section begins with the moment Harry allegedly realized that what he feared wasn't just repetition. It was escalation. What if the moment that finally broke the illusion wasn't explosive, but strategic? Ask yourself this. What scares you more? A loud confrontation you can see coming, or a quiet shift that tells you someone has already started planning 3 steps ahead? Because according to insiders, this next phase didn't begin with shouting. It began with precision. Subtle changes, different language, carefully timed silences, and a realization that made Harry stop reacting and start watching. Here's what people close to the situation describe as the turning point. Not a betrayal in the way the public expects, not infidelity, not a dramatic confession, but something colder, calculated. It started, allegedly, with information. Not secrets in the criminal sense, not scandals ready to explode, but deeply personal knowledge, emotional vulnerabilities, family fractures, mental health struggles, private conversations shared in moments of trust. The kind of information you only give to someone you believe is on your side. Now ask yourself this. What happens when that information starts resurfacing at convenient moments? When it's referenced not as comfort, but as context, not as empathy, but as leverage. Insiders say Harry began noticing a pattern in arguments and negotiations. When tension rose, certain topics reappeared. When boundaries were questioned, reminders followed. Not overt threats. Implications. If you do this, it could look bad. If that comes out, people won't understand. We've already been through so much. Do you really want to risk everything? At first glance, that sounds reasonable. Protective, even. But protection has a tell. It always centers on control. And control, once you feel it, is hard to unfeel. Harry, according to those close to him, didn't recognize it immediately. He rationalized it as stress, as trauma responses, as the cost of living under constant scrutiny. But the problem with rationalization is that it delays clarity. And clarity came anyway. Because Harry understands media. He understands narratives. He understands timing. And he understands how easily personal stories can be shaped into public weapons. So when conversations began to feel less like mutual problem-solving and more like positioning, alarm bells started ringing. Ask yourself this. When did conversations stop being about us and start being about what happens if? That's the shift insiders point to. This is where the phrase royal blackmail starts circulating behind closed doors. Not as a legal claim, not as an accusation carved in stone, but as shorthand for a dynamic that felt deeply wrong. Because blackmail doesn't always involve demands. Sometimes it involves reminders. Reminders of what could be lost. Reminders of what's at stake. Reminders of who controls which parts of the story. Harry reportedly found himself calculating consequences instead of expressing feelings. If I say this, what happens? If I push back, what narrative gets activated? If I refuse, what leverage gets deployed? These aren't questions you ask in a healthy partnership. They're questions you ask when power has entered the room. And once power enters, love stops being enough. Insiders say this realization hit hardest when the conversation turned to the future. Not the romantic future, the logistical one, where the children would live, who would have access, how public narratives would be framed, what would be shared, and what would remain protected. Protection, again, that word kept appearing. And the more it appeared, the more Harry reportedly felt something tightening around him. Because protection offered conditionally is no longer protection. It's a leash. Harry has always feared losing control of his own story. He's lived his life being defined by events he didn't choose, images he couldn't correct, narratives he couldn't escape. So the idea that his future, and his children's future, could be shaped by pressure rather than agreement terrified him. This is where the emotional stakes skyrocketed, because now it wasn't just about him. It was about legacy. Ask yourself this. What would it feel like to realize that the most important parts of your life could be used to keep you compliant? That's the fear insiders say began to dominate Harry's thinking. And fear changes behavior. He became quieter, more deliberate, less reactive, not because he gave up, because he started preparing. According to those close to him, this is when Harry began quietly seeking perspective, not making announcements, not drawing lines in the sand, just asking questions. Hypotheticals. What happens if two people disagree on this? How do custody decisions usually work in high-profile cases? What does protecting children actually look like in public separations? These weren't threats. They were reconnaissance. And here's where the irony deepens. Harry, the man accused for years of being impulsive, emotional, and reactive, allegedly became methodical. He stopped arguing to win. He started listening to understand. And what he understood frightened him. Because the more he learned, the clearer it became that leverage existed, and that leverage could be activated whether he wanted it to be or not. That's when fear turned into resolve. Not anger. Resolve. Resolve to stop being cornered. Resolve to stop negotiating under pressure. Resolve to stop confusing silence with peace. Insiders describe a moment when Harry reportedly realized that staying quiet wasn't de-escalating the situation. It was enabling it. And enabling, in this context, meant slowly giving up control over his own future. That realization didn't lead to immediate confrontation. It led to boundaries. Subtle ones at first. He questioned language. He asked for clarity. He pushed back, gently. The responses, sources say, told him everything he needed to know. Because when boundaries are met with understanding, relationships strengthen. When they're met with resistance, something else is at play. And resistance was exactly what he encountered. Not loud resistance. Strategic resistance. The kind that reframes boundaries as abandonment. That casts independence as betrayal. That treats disagreement as disloyalty. Ask yourself this. Why does someone feel threatened by boundaries? Because boundaries remove leverage. And leverage, once threatened, doesn't disappear quietly. Insiders claim this is when the emotional temperature shifted dramatically. The marriage entered a new phase. Less warmth, more calculation, less trust, more positioning. Harry reportedly began to feel like every move was being monitored, interpreted, and stored for potential future use. Whether that perception was entirely accurate or not is almost beside the point. Because perception governs behavior. And his behavior changed. He stopped sharing freely. He started documenting mentally. He weighed every conversation. That's not love. That's self-defense. And self-defense inside a marriage is the clearest sign something fundamental has broken. This is also where the idea of declaring divorce takes on a different meaning. Because according to insiders, Harry didn't see walking away as abandoning his family. He saw it as preventing escalation. Preventing a future where disagreements would be settled through narrative warfare instead of conversation. Preventing a dynamic where love would be continually overshadowed by leverage. Preventing his children from growing up inside a battle disguised as protection. But here's the twist. Even as Harry began mentally preparing for separation, he didn't want war. He wanted disengagement. Clean lines. Clear boundaries. Minimal fallout. But when leverage exists, clean exits are rare. And that's where this story gets even darker. Because insiders say the moment Harry began asserting independence is when the dynamic allegedly intensified. Not through shouting. Through signaling. Signals that said, "You're not as free as you think." Signals that said, "This won't be simple." Signals that said, "There are consequences." That's when Harry allegedly understood something chilling. The power imbalance he feared wasn't theoretical. It was operational. And once power becomes operational, intentions stop matching. Only outcomes do. This is the point where insiders say Harry made the internal decision. Not publicly, not dramatically, but firmly. that he would rather face the storm of leaving than the slow erosion of staying. Because storms pass, erosion doesn't. And this decision, quiet as it was, set everything in motion. The legal consultations, the distance, the shift in public tone. It wasn't revenge. It was containment. Containment of a situation that, left unchecked, could spiral into something far more destructive. And here's the final chilling thought. Insiders say Harry didn't decide to leave because he stopped loving. He decided to leave because he recognized that love was no longer the most powerful force in the relationship. Leverage was. And when leverage replaces love, the only winning move is to step away before the cost becomes irreversible. But stepping away doesn't end the story. It escalates it. Because the moment someone refuses to be controlled, the response reveals everything. And the next chapter begins with exactly that response. What if the reaction to independence tells you more than the relationship ever did? Sit with that for a moment. Because according to insiders, the most revealing part of this entire saga wasn't the quiet decision Harry allegedly made to protect himself and his children. It was what happened after. Not publicly, not immediately, but emotionally, behind closed doors. Because when someone begins to step out of a dynamic built on leverage, the system around them doesn't collapse right away. It resists. And resistance has a language. Sources describe a noticeable shift once Harry allegedly began asserting boundaries more clearly. Not aggressive ones. Not confrontational ones. Simple statements. Requests for clarity. Attempts to slow the pace of decisions that had once felt non-negotiable. And those attempts, insiders say, were not received as neutral. They were interpreted as betrayal. Ask yourself this. Why does independence feel threatening to someone who claims to want what's best for you? Because independence removes influence. And influence, once tasted, is rarely surrendered quietly. According to people familiar with the dynamic, conversations began taking on a sharper edge. Not louder, sharper. Words chosen carefully. Emotional appeals resurfacing at strategic moments. Appeals to history. Appeals to sacrifice. Appeals to everything that had already been lost. The message, insiders say, wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. It was implied. We've come too far. You know what this could do. You understand what's at stake. Those phrases carry weight when spoken in the right context. Because they don't argue the present. They threaten the future. Harry reportedly felt the pressure most intensely around one subject. The children. This is where the emotional temperature of the situation spiked dramatically. Because once children enter the equation, every disagreement becomes existential. Every boundary feels higher stakes. Every decision carries generational consequences. Insiders claim that discussions about routines, locations, schooling, and access began to feel less collaborative and more strategic. Not openly combative, but directional. Ask yourself this. Who defines what's best when two parents don't agree? And more importantly, who gets to frame that definition publicly? Harry has always been acutely aware of how narratives shape outcomes. He's seen how subtle framing can determine who is viewed as protective, who is viewed as reckless, who is viewed as stable, and who is painted as dangerous. So when conversations began to include phrases about optics, perception, and what people will say, alarm bells went off. Because once optics enter parenting decisions, the focus shifts. It's no longer about the child's experience. It's about control of the story around that experience. Insiders say this is when Harry's resolve hardened. Not because he wanted a fight, because he saw one coming. And this is where the palace re-enters the story in a way few expected. Contrary to popular belief, sources say the institution wasn't scrambling behind the scenes when whispers of separation began circulating. They were methodical, prepared, almost unsurprised. This detail keeps surfacing in insider accounts. They weren't shocked. That phrase comes up again and again, which raises a chilling question. What did they see that the public didn't? According to some close to the situation, quiet contingency planning had been underway for some time. Not because reminding Harry of his place was the goal, but because institutions, by nature, prepare for fractures before they're visible. Legal frameworks, jurisdictional considerations, child welfare structures. None of this means action had been taken, but it does mean options were mapped. And mapping options changes power dynamics instantly. Harry reportedly became aware that walking away didn't mean walking alone. It meant walking into a different kind of structure, one he had rejected emotionally, but one that now represented something else entirely. Stability. Not the rigid, suffocating kind he fled, but the kind that sets boundaries when things become unsafe. That realization creates an internal conflict few people ever face. Do you accept help from the system you once blamed, or remain trapped in a dynamic that feels increasingly unbalanced? That's not a moral dilemma. It's a survival one. Insiders say Harry didn't run back to the palace. He didn't reverse course. But he did something quietly significant. He stopped positioning himself as someone with no support. And that changed the equation. Because leverage only works when the other side believes they're alone. Once that illusion breaks, pressure loses effectiveness. This is where things reportedly escalated emotionally. Not outwardly, inwardly. Harry began noticing shifts in tone. Less reassurance. More rigidity. Less openness. More framing. Framing of motives. Framing of intentions. Framing of future consequences. This is where insiders say the word blackmail began circulating more seriously in private conversations. Again, not as a legal accusation, as a description of a feeling. The feeling that personal vulnerabilities were being held too close to the surface. The feeling that independence was being met with subtle warnings. Warnings that said, you don't control this alone. Ask yourself this. How do you negotiate freely when the cost of disagreement feels disproportionate? Harry reportedly tried one last approach. De-escalation. He slowed down, reduced conflict, avoided confrontation, focused on calm co-parenting language, emphasized shared goals. And for a moment, insiders say, it seemed to work. Tension lowered. Conversations softened. Hope flickered. But hope built on avoidance doesn't last. Because unresolved power dynamics don't dissolve. They wait. And they waited until the subject everyone had been circling finally surfaced explicitly. Separation. Not as an ultimatum. As a possibility. According to insiders, this is when everything changed. The idea that Harry might choose distance rather than continued negotiation reportedly triggered a sharp emotional response. Not panic. Recalculation. Suddenly, conversations became more formal. Language tightened. Emotional appeals became more pronounced. References to past sacrifices resurfaced with renewed intensity. The subtext was unmistakable. If you do this, it will get messy. Harry, sources say, felt something crystallize in that moment. Not fear. Clarity. Because once someone implies chaos as a deterrent, they reveal how they operate under threat. And Harry understood that the longer he delayed, the more leverage would accumulate against him. Delay, in this context, wasn't kindness. It was vulnerability. This is when he allegedly made the internal decision to stop negotiating emotionally and start preparing structurally. Not aggressively. Deliberately. Legal consultations weren't about attack. They were about containment. Understanding worst-case scenarios. Mapping jurisdictional risks. Protecting the children from being used as leverage. This wasn't about winning. It was about minimizing damage. Insiders emphasized this repeatedly. Harry wasn't preparing to destroy anyone. He was preparing to survive. And that distinction matters. Because when preparation is framed as hostility, it invites escalation. But preparation born of fear invites something else. Exposure. And exposure, in high-profile separations, is the nuclear option. Which brings us to the most unsettling part of this chapter. Sources claim Harry became increasingly concerned not just about what could be said, but about how it could be said. Timing, framing, sympathy. Because in modern scandals, truth isn't enough. Narrative wins. And narrative, once unleashed, is almost impossible to contain. Harry reportedly understood that silence wouldn't protect him if the story turned. It would only make him vulnerable. So he did something that surprised even those close to him. He began preparing his own version of events. Not to release immediately, to hold. Because leverage cuts both ways. And sometimes, the only way to neutralize it is to ensure mutual vulnerability. That's not revenge. It's deterrence. This is where the phrase declares divorce takes on its full meaning. It wasn't about paperwork. It was about signaling. Signaling that he would no longer operate under implied threats. Signaling that separation would happen on terms designed to protect the children, not the narrative. Signaling that silence was no longer the default. And that signal landed. Hard. Because once someone demonstrates they're willing to walk away despite the risks, the entire dynamic shifts. Control erodes, influence weakens, and the next move becomes unpredictable. Insiders say this is when private communications allegedly became more guarded, more calculated, and more defensive. Because once leverage stops working quietly, it tends to surface loudly. And that's where this story is headed next. Because the response to Harry's resolve wasn't reconciliation. It was repositioning. And repositioning, in a story. Harry reportedly felt the ground shift beneath him. Not because he was surprised, but because the quiet confirmed what he already suspected. That this wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about who would control the meaning of that ending. Ask yourself this. In a world where perception often outweighs fact, who wins when the story breaks? Because someone always breaks it. Insiders say this is when subtle signaling began. Not overt threats. Not dramatic ultimatums. Signals designed to test reactions. A quote here. A carefully timed appearance there. A narrative breadcrumb dropped just far enough from the source to maintain plausible distance. The goal wasn't exposure. It was pressure. Pressure that says, we can shape this if we need to. Harry, by all accounts, noticed. And instead of reacting, he did something unexpected. He slowed everything down. No public statements. No countersignals. No emotional displays. Just restraint. That restraint confused people. Because silence is often mistaken for weakness. But silence can also be preparation. According to those close to Harry, this was the most disciplined period of his adult life. The impulsivity he was often accused of disappeared. Emotional reactions were filtered. Decisions were weighed against long-term consequences rather than short-term relief. Ask yourself this. What does it mean when the emotional one becomes the most controlled person in the room? It changes the balance. And balance was exactly what this situation no longer had. This is where the idea of exposure becomes unavoidable. Not because Harry wanted it. Because once narrative positioning starts, exposure becomes the currency everyone fears. Sources claim Harry became acutely aware that any misstep, any emotional outburst, any defensive move could be reframed as instability. He had seen this play out before. Not with his marriage. With his mother. That's the parallel insiders say haunted him most. Not the events themselves. The framing. A woman expressing distress becomes difficult. A man setting boundaries becomes abandoning. Silence becomes guilt. Emotion becomes volatility. Harry understood that once that framing takes hold, facts struggle to catch up. So instead of speaking, he listened. Instead of correcting, he observed. Instead of reacting, he documented mentally. This is where sources say Harry began assembling what they describe as a quiet record. Not a dossier. A memory map. Dates. Conversations. Shifts in tone. Patterns of pressure. Not because he planned to use them immediately. Because he needed to understand the terrain. Ask yourself this. Why does someone start paying attention to patterns unless they feel unsafe? This is where insiders say the concept of royal blackmail stopped being abstract and started feeling imminent. Not in the sense of a single threat, but in the sense of cumulative leverage. Because leverage doesn't always announce itself. It accumulates quietly until one side realizes the other has more to lose. And Harry, sources say, realized he had more to lose than he ever admitted publicly. Not money, not status, time with his children, control over his identity, the ability to live without constant defensive posture. Those were the real stakes. This is when Harry reportedly accepted something painful. That protecting his children might require him to accept temporary damage to his own image. And that's a trade most parents will make without hesitation. But making that trade requires one thing. Preparation. Insiders say this is when Harry's approach shifted again. From internal readiness to external readiness. Not announcements. Infrastructure. Legal frameworks were quietly reviewed. Jurisdictional questions were clarified. Child welfare considerations were prioritized above everything else. This wasn't about winning custody. It was about preventing chaos. Because chaos is where narratives thrive. And Harry understood that chaos would benefit anyone prepared to weaponize it. So he worked to remove it. And here's the contradiction that defines this entire chapter. The more calmly Harry prepared, the more the situation around him reportedly tightened. Not relaxed. Tightened. Because calm preparation disrupts leverage. Leverage depends on emotional reaction. fear, panic, guilt. When those don't appear, pressure loses its effect. And pressure without effect tends to escalate. Sources say this escalation didn't look like confrontation. It looked like positioning. Stories about concern. Questions about well-being. Subtle suggestions of instability framed as care. Ask yourself this. How often does concern mask control? Because concern is hard to argue with publicly. And that's what made this phase so dangerous. The narrative wasn't accusatory. It was sympathetic, which is far more powerful. Harry reportedly recognized this immediately. Because sympathy can be a cage. Once you're inside it, every attempt to assert independence looks like proof that you need more supervision. That realization hardened his resolve. Not into anger, into precision. Insiders say Harry made a decision at this point. If the story was going to break, it would not break in a vacuum. He would not allow silence to be interpreted for him. He would not allow concern to be weaponized against him. But he also wouldn't rush. Timing matters. Because whoever speaks first often loses control. And Harry understood that. This is where the phrase declares divorce begins to circulate among insiders. Not because papers were filed publicly, because the decision was no longer internal. It was communicated, quietly, directly, without emotion. A declaration not meant for the public, meant for the dynamic. Sources say this declaration landed like a shockwave, because it wasn't framed as a plea. It wasn't framed as a threat. It was framed as a boundary. And boundaries change everything. The response, insiders claim, revealed the final truth. Not denial. Repositioning. That's when Harry reportedly understood something with absolute clarity. That reconciliation was no longer the goal. Control of outcome was. And once that becomes the goal, exposure becomes inevitable. Because you can't control both the process and the narrative forever. Something always leaks. Something always surfaces. And according to those closest to the situation, the next phase was no longer about preventing exposure. It was about surviving it. Because once both sides realize leverage exists, the question stops being whether it will be used. The question becomes who uses it first. And that's where this story is headed next. Because the next chapter isn't about planning or positioning. It's about the moment the narrative cracks. And when it does, the consequences won't be private. They'll be global. What if the first crack in the narrative didn't come from a leak at all, but from a contradiction too big to ignore? Think about that. Not a document. Not a recording. Not a headline screaming betrayal. Just a moment when two versions of the same story could no longer coexist. Because according to insiders, this next phase didn't begin with exposure. It began with dissonance. Subtle at first. A statement that didn't quite line up with a previous one. A gesture that contradicted the tone being presented. A public reassurance that clashed with private behavior. And once people started noticing those inconsistencies, the narrative stopped feeling airtight. Ask yourself this. How often does a story unravel not because it's attacked, but because it can't sustain itself? Sources say this is when the atmosphere shifted from containment to anticipation. Not anticipation of reconciliation. Anticipation of rupture. Because once a narrative requires constant adjustment to stay intact, it's already under strain. Harry reportedly sensed it too. Not as panic, as inevitability. He understood something fundamental about modern scandals. They don't explode. They erode. And erosion accelerates when too many people are watching the same cracks. This is where the role of timing becomes critical. Because insiders say Harry was fully aware that whatever came next would define him for years. Possibly for life. He wasn't just navigating a separation. He was navigating an identity reset under the harshest spotlight imaginable. And identity resets are brutal when the story is contested. Ask yourself this. Who do people believe when two sides claim to be protecting the same thing? The children, the truth, the future. Those words sound noble. But they can be wielded. Sources describe a moment when Harry reportedly realized the narrative had shifted away from working things out to managing perception. And once perception becomes the battleground, honesty becomes risky. Because honesty doesn't always align with sympathy. This is where the emotional cost began to show. Not in public, in isolation. Harry, according to those close to him, felt the weight of every possible outcome pressing down at once. If he spoke too soon, he risked escalation. If he stayed silent too long, he risked losing control of the story. If he reacted emotionally, he risked being framed as unstable. If he stayed calm, he risked being painted as cold. Every option carried damage. So he chose the one that minimized harm to the people who mattered most. The children. Insiders say this decision guided everything that followed. Not revenge, not vindication, protection. But protection in this context didn't mean secrecy. It meant structure. Harry reportedly leaned into routine, predictability, and consistency in his private life, even as uncertainty loomed publicly. He kept his circle tight, his schedule disciplined, his communication minimal and deliberate. This wasn't withdrawal. It was stabilization. And stabilization, ironically, created more suspicion than chaos would have. Because chaos fits expectations. Calm doesn't. Ask yourself this. Why does calm in the middle of a rumored crisis make people uncomfortable? Because calm suggests preparation, and preparation suggests awareness. This is where insiders say the pressure intensified again. Not dramatically, incrementally. More concerned narratives, more questions about well-being, more emphasis on emotional fragility framed as empathy. The language shifted from conflict to care, and that shift was strategic. Because care narratives are harder to dispute without looking defensive. Harry reportedly recognized this immediately, and it angered him, not in the explosive sense, in the focused sense, because he understood the danger of being trapped inside someone else's concern. Concern limits autonomy. Concern justifies oversight. Concern reframes resistance as proof of the concern itself. It's a closed loop, and once you're in it, every move reinforces the same conclusion. Harry did not want to be inside that loop, so he took a step few expected. He disengaged emotionally from the narrative, not from his responsibilities, from the performance. According to insiders, this is when Harry stopped trying to be understood and started prioritizing being safe. There's a difference. Being understood requires explanation. Being safe requires boundaries, and boundaries are rarely popular. This is also where the phrase declares divorce takes on its most misunderstood meaning. Because to the outside world, divorce looks like abandonment. But to someone inside a dynamic governed by leverage, divorce can look like disengagement from a game you didn't agree to play. Insiders say Harry viewed separation not as the end of a relationship, but as the only way to remove power from a dynamic that had become unbalanced. That doesn't make it painless. It makes it necessary. But necessity doesn't guarantee cooperation. And this is where the narrative truly began to crack. Sources claim that as Harry's intentions became harder to ignore, the messaging around him subtly shifted. Not accusations, implications. Words like unstable, overwhelmed, struggling began to appear more frequently, always couched in sympathy. Ask yourself this. When does sympathy stop being support and start being a weapon? Harry, who has spent years advocating for mental health awareness, found himself facing a deeply ironic reality. The language of mental health, the very language he helped normalize, could now be used to undermine his autonomy. That realization cut deeply, because it placed him in an impossible position. Push back, and you look defensive. Stay silent, and the framing sticks. Insiders say this is when Harry made a crucial internal shift. He stopped thinking about how to win. He started thinking about how to endure. Endurance changes strategy. It prioritizes longevity over victory. And longevity, in this case, meant ensuring that whatever narrative emerged, it could not be used to strip him of agency as a parent. This is where preparation crossed into readiness. Harry reportedly ensured that his personal conduct was unimpeachable. No public outbursts. No reactive statements. No fuel for speculation. He understood that in the absence of facts, behavior becomes evidence. So he made his behavior boring, predictable, uninteresting. That, ironically, made others nervous. Because boring doesn't sell. And when there's nothing dramatic to amplify, pressure builds to create something. This is when insiders say the risk of exposure reached its peak. Not because anyone wanted it. Because the stalemate couldn't hold forever. At some point, someone would blink. Someone would speak. Someone would frame. Harry reportedly knew this. And he knew that when the story finally broke, it wouldn't break evenly. It would break asymmetrically. One side would move first. One side would control the initial narrative. And whoever moved first would likely set the tone for everything that followed. This is where timing became everything. Harry waited. Not passively. Intentionally. He waited for a moment when the contradiction in the narrative became undeniable, when the public story no longer matched observable reality, when silence would no longer protect anyone. Insiders say that moment arrived quietly, a missed appearance, an absence that couldn't be explained away, a gap where reassurance was expected and didn't come. And suddenly, questions started forming, not accusations. Curiosity. Curiosity is dangerous, because curiosity invites speculation, and speculation invites leaks. This is where the pressure to control the story intensified dramatically. Behind the scenes, sources say, conversations became more urgent, messaging more coordinated. The desire to shape the narrative before it shaped itself grew stronger by the day. Harry reportedly felt it. The tightening, the sense that the window for a calm, contained separation was closing. And this is where the emotional cost peaked, because Harry was forced to confront a brutal truth. That even if he did everything right, someone else could still decide how the story was told. That even if his intentions were pure, perception might not follow. And that the moment the narrative cracked, there would be no way to fully control what came out. So he made peace with something most people never have to face. That protecting what mattered most might require absorbing damage he couldn't prevent. That his reputation might suffer. That misunderstandings might linger. That silence might be interpreted as guilt. And he accepted it, because some costs are smaller than others. This is the emotional place the story reached just before the break. A man calm on the surface, prepared beneath it, fully aware that the next move, whoever made it, would change everything. Because once the narrative cracks, it doesn't reseal. It fractures, and fractures spread. The next chapter begins with that spread. The moment the story stops being managed and starts being contested. And once that happens, the question is no longer who controls the narrative. It's who survives it. What if the moment the narrative finally slipped out of control didn't come from a confession, but from a vacuum? A vacuum where answers were expected and none arrived. Because that's when stories don't just spread. They multiply. Ask yourself this. What happens when silence stops being interpreted as dignity and starts being read as avoidance? According to insiders, this is the precise moment everything accelerated. Not because anyone wanted it to. Because the space left behind demanded to be filled. The absence became the headline. Harry's continued restraint, once seen as discipline, began to be framed differently. The calm that once suggested preparation was quietly reframed as withdrawal. The predictability that once signaled stability was now described as distance. And distance, in a narrative war, is dangerous. Because distance invites interpretation. Sources say this is when secondary voices began stepping in. Not principals, proxies, people close to the situation, individuals familiar with the matter. Sources who spoke on condition of anonymity. The language was careful, always careful, because careful language gives cover. These weren't accusations. They were concerns, not claims. Questions. Is he okay? Has he been coping? Is the pressure finally getting to him? Ask yourself this. Why do questions sometimes feel heavier than statements? Because questions don't need proof. They only need repetition. Harry reportedly watched this shift with a kind of grim understanding. Not surprise. Recognition. He had seen this mechanism before. Concern framed as curiosity. Curiosity framed as responsibility. Responsibility framed as justification. Once that chain starts, it's hard to stop. And here's the cruel irony insiders keep pointing out. Harry couldn't respond without validating the premise. If he denied distress, it could be framed as denial. If he acknowledged strain, it could be framed as instability. If he stayed silent, it could be framed as avoidance. Every response strengthened the same narrative loop. So he chose none. And that choice, according to sources, made the situation more volatile. Because silence is intolerable when others are invested in shaping meaning. This is where pressure turned into impatience. Not from the public, from behind the scenes. Sources describe a growing urgency to clarify the situation, to get ahead of speculation, to offer reassurance. But reassurance requires agreement. And Harry reportedly refused to participate in messaging that didn't align with his lived reality. That refusal mattered, because it disrupted coordination. And coordination is the backbone of narrative control. Without it, stories don't move in straight lines. They splinter. This is when insiders say the phrase royal blackmail began appearing in hushed conversations not as a label, but as a fear. Not fear of accusation, fear of escalation. Because when narrative pressure fails, leverage tends to surface more directly, not necessarily through threats, through reminders. Reminders of shared history, reminders of past sacrifices, reminders of what could be lost if things became ugly. Harry reportedly recognized these reminders for what they were. Attempts to pull him back into negotiation through emotional cost. But here's the shift. By this point, Harry wasn't negotiating emotionally anymore. He was assessing risk. Risk to the children. Risk to stability. Risk to long-term autonomy. And when you assess risk, sentiment becomes secondary. That doesn't make you cold. It makes you clear. Sources say Harry's